The cold barrel of a shotgun pressed against Grace Lowell's temple as her uncle dragged her through the swinging doors of the Dry Gulch saloon, his gnarled fingers digging into her arm with enough force to leave bruises beneath the sleeve of her tattered dress. The year was 1875, and in this dusty corner of Arizona territory, human life often held less value than a bottle of whiskey. "Anyone here looking for a woman?" Uncle Tobias bellowed, his voice slurring from the alcohol already coursing through his veins. "Got myself a fine niece, 20 years old. Strong back, can cook, clean, and keep a man warm at night." The saloon fell silent. Poker chips stopped clicking, conversations died mid-sentence, and even the piano player's fingers froze over the yellowed keys. Every pair of eyes in the establishment turned toward the spectacle unfolding near the entrance. Grace kept her gaze fixed on the sawdust-covered floor, shame burning her cheeks. Since her parents had died of cholera 3 months prior, leaving her in the care of her father's brother, life had become a waking nightmare. Tobias had squandered what little inheritance her father had left, spent it all on gambling and liquor, and now he had resorted to this final indignity. "5 bottles of your finest whiskey," Tobias announced, addressing the barkeep. "That's my price." The barkeep, a heavyset man with a greasy apron stretched across his belly, simply shook his head in disgust. "Tobias, you're drunk. Take the girl home." "She ain't got no home anymore," Tobias laughed, the sound hollow and cruel. "I lost the cabin in a game of cards last night, so who'll take her? 5 bottles. That's a bargain." Grace felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give her uncle or these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her mother hadn't raised her to surrender to despair. Even in the darkest moments, from the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A tall figure rose from a table in the shadows and approached with measured steps. The crowd parted before him like water around a stone. "I'll pay," a deep voice stated firmly. The man who stepped forward wore a long duster, dusty from the trail but of good quality. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but Grace could make out a strong jawline shadowed with several days' worth of beard. A star-shaped badge gleamed on his chest, not a local lawman, she realized, but a U.S. Marshal. "Well now," Tobias grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth, "seems we got ourselves a buyer after all." The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. With deliberate movements, he counted out several gold coins onto the bar counter. "This should cover it," he said. $20 in gold. Tobias's eyes widened at the sight of actual currency. "Well, Marshal, that's mighty generous of you. She's all yours." He released his grip on Grace's arm and shoved her toward the stranger, snatching up the coins with his free hand. The Marshal steadied Grace with a gentle touch to her elbow, then turned back to Tobias. "You misunderstand. I'm not buying her." Confusion crossed Tobias's weathered face. "But you just paid. I paid what you're owed for her care as her guardian, which you've clearly neglected." The Marshal's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. "She's worth more than my life, let alone 5 bottles of rot-gut whiskey." A ripple of murmurs spread through the saloon. The Marshal turned to Grace, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, clear, intense blue eyes that held neither pity nor lecherous intent, but something far more dangerous: respect. "My name is Marshal Vaughn Hayes," he said quietly. "And if you'll allow it, I'd like to help you get safely away from here." Grace hesitated, studying the man before her. She had learned the hard way that men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply. Then, with a slight smile that softened his stern features, he added, "And because my sister would haunt me from beyond the grave if I rode past someone in need." Before Grace could respond, Tobias lurched forward, the shotgun wavering in his unsteady grip. "Now wait just a minute," he slurred. "If you ain't buying her services, then she's still mine to sell." Vaughn moved with unexpected speed for a man of his size. One moment he stood beside Grace, the next Tobias was disarmed, the shotgun now in the Marshal's possession. "Mr. Lowell," Vaughn said, his tone conversational despite the tension in the air, "I suggest you take that gold and leave town. Because if I see you again, I'll arrest you for attempted human trafficking, which carries a minimum sentence of 10 years in territorial prison." Tobias's face contorted with rage, but even in his drunken state, he recognized the futility of his position. Muttering curses, he clutched the gold coins in his fist and stormed out of the saloon. Grace stood motionless, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. The saloon gradually returned to life around them, though she noticed several patrons watching with undisguised interest. "You have family anywhere else?" Vaughn asked, breaking the shell of her thoughts. Grace shook her head. "No, my parents were my only family aside from him." Vaughn nodded, considering. "I'm heading to Willow Creek. It's a decent town about 3 days' ride from here. My sister-in-law runs a boarding house there. She could use help, and it would give you someplace safe while you figure things out." Grace weighed her options, which were painfully few. Stay in Dry Gulch, where her uncle might return once the gold ran out, or trust this stranger who had just spent $20 to secure her freedom. Why would you spend your own money? That was nearly a month's wages for most working men. Like I said, you're worth more than that. His eyes held her steadily. Much more. Something in his gaze made her believe him, despite all the lessons life had taught her about the cruelty of men. "I accept your offer, Marshal Hayes," Grace said finally, "and I'll find a way to repay you, no need. Consider it an investment in justice." He offered a slight bow. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow. Do you have belongings to collect?" "Just a small bag at my uncle's former cabin. We'll retrieve it on our way out of town." He glanced around the saloon. "For tonight, I've taken a room upstairs. You can have it." "I'll sleep in the chair outside the door." Grace opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "Thank you," she said simply. Morning came with a pale golden light filtering through the thin curtains of the rented room. Grace had slept fitfully, unaccustomed to the softness of her real bed after weeks of sleeping on a pallet on her uncle's floor. She'd washed her face and hands in the basin, combed her chestnut hair as best she could with her fingers, and straightened her worn dress before opening the door. True to his word, Marshal Hayes sat in a straight-back chair opposite her door, his hat tipped forward over his eyes. At the sound of the door opening, he was instantly alert, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Good morning," he said. "I've arranged for breakfast downstairs." Over a simple meal of eggs, bacon, and surprisingly good biscuits, Vaughn outlined their journey. "We'll head north through Thompson Pass, then follow the river valley to Willow Creek. The trail's good most of the way, though there's a stretch that gets narrow through the foothills." Grace nodded, absorbing the information. "I'm a strong rider," she offered. "My father taught me from childhood." "Good, that'll make things easier." He paused, studying her. "I should warn you I'm tracking a fugitive who was last seen heading in the same direction. If we catch sign of him, I may need to pursue. I'd leave you somewhere safe first." "Who is he?" Grace asked, curious despite herself. "Named Silas Emerson. Robbed 3 banks and killed 2 men in the process." "I've heard of him. They say he rides with the Blackwell gang." Vaughn nodded. "Used to. They had a falling out over the division of their last score. He's been operating alone since then, which makes him desperate and more dangerous." After breakfast, they retrieved Grace's meager belongings from the abandoned cabin. The small leather satchel contained all she had left in the world. A photograph of her parents in a tarnished frame, her mother's wedding ring, a change of clothes, and a book of poetry her father had given her on her 18th birthday. Vaughn provided a steady bay mare for her to ride, while he mounted a powerful black gelding. They left Dry Gulch behind without ceremony, the town's handful of buildings quickly disappearing into the vast landscape of rust-colored mesas and scrubby vegetation. They rode in comfortable silence for much of the morning, Grace gradually relaxing in the saddle as the distance between her and her old life increased. By midday, when they stopped to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack, she found herself studying her companion openly. In the clear light of day, Marshal Hayes appeared younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or 32. His features were strong rather than handsome in the conventional sense, with a straight nose that bore evidence of having been broken at least once, and a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. His dark hair was longer than most lawmen wore theirs, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked as they sat in the shade of a large boulder. "5 years with the badge," he replied. "Before that, I rode with the cavalry during the last years of the war." "You're from the East," he smiled slightly. "Is my accent that obvious?" "Boston originally, but I haven't been back in over a decade." "What brought you west?" Vaughn took a long drink from his canteen before answering. "Same as most men, I suppose, opportunity, adventure." He paused, his gaze distant, "and running from ghosts." Grace didn't press further, recognizing the shadows that crossed his face. Everyone who came west carried something they were trying to leave behind. They made camp that evening in a sheltered arroyo, with a small fire to ward off the desert chill. Vaughn produced a pot and some coffee, along with dried beans and salt pork that made a surprisingly hearty stew. "You cook better than I expected," Grace admitted as she savored the simple meal. "Necessity teaches even the most hopeless cases," he replied with a hint of self-deprecation. "When I first came west, I nearly poisoned myself with my own cooking. A Shoshone scout took pity on me and showed me the basics." "My mother always said that cooking is just paying attention," Grace offered. "She could make something delicious out of almost nothing." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Grace stared into the fire, memories washing over her. "Papa was the dreamer in our family. He brought us west when I was 12, certain he'd strike silver in the mountains. We never found wealth, but he managed to keep us fed and housed." She sighed. "Until the fever took them both within a week of each other." Vaughn nodded solemnly. "Losing family is never easy, no matter the circumstances. You speak from experience." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "My wife and daughter 4 years ago, influenza." Grace felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry, as am I for your loss." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. "After they died, I couldn't bear to stay in our home. The marshal's service gave me purpose, a reason to keep moving." The confession hung in the air between them, creating a tentative bridge of shared grief. Grace found herself wanting to reach across that bridge to touch his hand in comfort, but she restrained herself. His kindness didn't invite such familiarity. Instead, she asked, "Does it get easier?" "The grief, I mean." "Not easier," he replied thoughtfully. "Different. Less like drowning and more like carrying a heavy pack that you occasionally forget you're wearing. Then something reminds you and you feel the weight all over again." Grace nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Thank you for your honesty." "Get some sleep," he said gently. "I'll take first watch." As she settled into her bedroll, Grace found herself studying the stars overhead, pondering the strange twist of fate that had led her to this moment. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The second day of travel brought them into rockier terrain, with juniper and pinyon pines dotting the landscape. The air grew cooler as they gradually gained elevation, and Grace welcomed the change after months in the scorching lowlands. Around midday, Vaughn suddenly raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. He sat perfectly still in the saddle, his eyes scanning the ridge to their left. "What is it?" Grace whispered. "Dust cloud, moving fast. Could be nothing, but—" He dismounted in one fluid motion. "Let's get the horses off the trail, just to be safe." They led their mounts into a copse of trees, tying them securely before Vaughn guided Grace to a position behind a large boulder. He drew his rifle from its scabbard and checked the action with practiced movements. "Stay down," he instructed, his voice low but calm. "If anything happens, take my horse and ride north. Follow the trail we've been on until you reach the river, then turn east. You'll find Willow Creek within a day's ride." Grace's heart hammered in her chest, but she nodded, determined not to show fear. "I won't leave you." Before he could argue, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Vaughn crouched beside her, his body tense but his hands steady on the rifle. 3 riders appeared on the trail below their position, moving at a canter. 2 men and a woman, all heavily armed. They didn't look like typical travelers with their mismatched clothes and wary postures. "Bounty hunters," Vaughn murmured. "Looking for Emerson, most likely." The reward's substantial. The trio passed without incident, disappearing around a bend in the trail. Vaughn waited a full 5 minutes before standing. "Let's move on," he said, "but we'll stay off the main trail for a while." They traveled through rougher country for the rest of the day, making slower progress but avoiding any further encounters. By nightfall, Grace's muscles ached from the challenging ride, though she didn't complain. As they made camp in a small clearing surrounded by pines, Vaughn seemed more vigilant than the previous night, frequently pausing in his preparations to listen to the forest sounds around them. "Are you concerned about those bounty hunters?" Grace asked as she helped prepare their meal. "Them and others who might be in the area," he replied. "Emerson has friends as well as enemies. The territory's crawling with desperate men these days. And here I thought my uncle was the worst of them," she said with a wry smile. Vaughn's expression softened. "Your uncle is a product of his circumstances, like many out here. The West breaks some men, twists others." "And what about you, Marshal Hayes?" Grace asked, emboldened by the intimacy of the firelight. "Has the West changed you?" He considered the question seriously. "It's stripped away pretenses, I suppose. Out here, a man can only rely on what's genuinely part of him. The rest gets worn away by sun and wind and hardship. And what remains for you?" His eyes met hers across the fire. "A sense of duty, respect for life, and hope despite everything I've seen." Grace felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different paths. "I still don't understand why you helped me," she admitted. "Most men would have walked away or taken advantage. Most men haven't seen what happens when good people do nothing." He stared into the flames. "Besides, I recognized something in you. Strength, resilience, the same qualities my Caroline had, your wife," he nodded. "She came west as a schoolteacher, determined to bring education to frontier children. Never complained about the hardships, never lost her belief that things could be better." A sad smile touched his lips. "Our daughter Emily was just like her." The pain in his voice was raw, even after 4 years. Grace found herself moving around the fire to sit beside him, her shoulder lightly touching his in silent support. "Tell me about them," she said softly. "I'd like to know." And so, under a blanket of stars, Vaughn shared stories of his lost family, Caroline's determination to establish a proper school in their small Colorado mining town, Emily's fascination with butterflies, and her habit of leaving her father little drawings in his saddlebags when he had to ride out on patrol. In return, Grace spoke of her own parents, her father's boundless optimism and her mother's practical wisdom. The sharing of memories felt like a sacred exchange, and when they finally settled into their bedrolls for the night, something had fundamentally changed between them. The third day dawned misty and cool, with the scent of pine sharp in the air. They broke camp efficiently, falling into an easy rhythm of shared tasks. As they rode, Grace found herself watching Vaughn more frequently, noticing the way he sat tall in the saddle, the gentleness with which he handled his horse, the alertness that never seemed to leave him even in seemingly peaceful moments. Around midday, they emerged from the foothills to see a vast valley spread before them, a river cutting a silver path through the center. In the distance, Grace could make out the clustered buildings of what must be Willow Creek. "We'll reach town by sundown," Vaughn said, satisfaction evident in his voice. They had just started down the trail toward the valley when a gunshot cracked through the air. Vaughn's horse reared as a bullet kicked up dirt just inches from its hooves. In an instant, Vaughn had dismounted and pulled Grace from her saddle, positioning himself between her and the unseen shooter. "Into those rocks," he ordered, pointing to a nearby outcropping. More shots rang out as they scrambled for cover, bullets whining off stone. Once behind the protection of the boulders, Vaughn drew his revolver and peered cautiously around the edge. 3 men, he reported. "Coming up from the south, they're wearing masks." "Bandits?" Grace asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Possibly, or Emerson's associates. Either way, they're determined." He checked his ammunition. "Stay down. I'm going to work my way around to flank them." Before Grace could protest, he was gone, moving with surprising stealth through the rocks. She pressed herself against the boulder, trying to control her rapid breathing. The shooting had stopped momentarily, an eerie silence falling over the landscape. Then a voice called out, rough and taunting. "We know you're Marshal Hayes. Throw out your badge and the girl, and maybe we'll let you live." Grace's blood ran cold. They knew who Vaughn was. This wasn't a random attack. Another voice, closer now. Emerson sends his regards, says to tell you this is for Johnson City. More gunfire erupted, the sound echoing across the valley. Grace covered her ears, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Then she heard Vaughn return fire 3 measured shots from a different position than where she'd last seen him. A man cried out in pain. The shooting intensified, bullets chipping away at the rocks around her hiding place. Grace flattened herself against the ground, terrified but determined not to give in to panic. Suddenly, one of the attackers appeared around the edge of the boulder, his face hidden behind a bandana. Grace screamed, scrabbling backward as he reached for her. Just as his fingers brushed her ankle, a shot rang out and the man crumpled to the ground. Vaughn appeared behind him, his face grim. "We need to move." Now, he pulled Grace to her feet and led her in a crouching run through the rocks, away from their original position. Bullets followed their path, but the shooters seemed uncertain of their location. "The horses," Grace gasped as they found shelter behind a fallen tree. "They bolted during the first volley," Vaughn replied. "We'll have to continue on foot. How many are left? 2 that I can see." "One's wounded." He peered over the log. "They're trying to circle around. We need to reach that ravine." He pointed to a narrow cut in the terrain about 50 yards away. "It leads down to the river. If we can get there, we can follow it to town." Grace nodded, gathering her courage. "On your signal." Vaughn squeezed her hand briefly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When I start firing, run. Don't stop until you reach the ravine. I'll be right behind you." Before she could respond, he rose to a kneeling position and began firing methodically at their attackers' positions. Grace launched herself forward, running in a zigzag pattern as Vaughn had taught her during their journey. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet, but she kept moving, focused solely on reaching the ravine. She practically fell into the narrow gully, scraping her hands and knees on the rocky slope. A moment later, Vaughn slid down beside her, his breathing heavy. "Are you hit?" he asked urgently, his hands checking her shoulders and arms. "No, I'm fine," she assured him. "You grazed my side, nothing serious." He gestured downstream. "They'll be after us. We need to keep moving." They made their way along the ravine, which gradually deepened into a proper canyon. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and eventually they reached the river wider and faster than it had appeared from the ridge. "We can follow the bank," Vaughn said, but even as the words left his mouth, shots rang out from the canyon rim above them. "They're persistent," Grace observed, ducking instinctively. Emerson must have offered them a substantial reward. Vaughn scanned their surroundings, assessing options. "The water's our best chance. They'll expect us to follow the bank." Grace eyed the swiftly moving river dubiously. "Can we cross it?" "No need. There's a town ferry about 2 miles downstream. If we stay in the shallows along the edge, we can make it." He glanced at her worn boots and dress. "It'll be cold, though." "I'd rather be cold than dead," Grace said firmly. With a nod of approval, Vaughn led the way into the water. The shock of cold made Grace gasp, but she pressed on, keeping close to the rocky bank as they waded downstream. The water rarely rose above their knees, though occasional deeper spots required careful navigation. Above them, they could hear their pursuers shouting to each other, trying to spot them from the canyon rim. The river's path soon curved away from the ravine, providing better cover from those above. They had been in the water for perhaps half an hour when Vaughn suddenly stopped, listening intently. "Horses," he said quietly, pointing ahead. Around the next bend, the river widened, and the bank on their side sloped gently upward to a small clearing. 2 riders were visible there, dismounted and examining the ground. "More of them," Grace whispered. Vaughn shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "No, those are our horses." Sure enough, as they watched, Vaughn's black gelding raised its head and nickered softly in their direction. The 2 figures turned, revealing themselves to be an elderly man and a younger woman. "River Patrol," Vaughn explained, relief evident in his voice. "Willow Creek employs them to monitor the ferry and assist travelers. Our horses must have made their way downstream." They emerged from the water, Grace shivering in her soaked clothing. The River Patrol officers hurried to meet them, concern evident on their faces. "Marshal Hayes." The older man called. Your horses came tearing down the trail like the devil himself was after them. Are you all right? Ambushed by some of Emerson's men, Vaughn explained briefly. They may still be pursuing us. The woman immediately handed Grace a blanket from her saddlebag. Wrap yourself in this before you catch your death, miss. Town's just a mile farther. We can escort you. With the patrol officers flanking them, they mounted their recovered horses and rode the remaining distance to Willow Creek without incident. As they entered the town, Grace took in the neat wooden buildings, the church steeple rising above the other structures, and the bustle of activity that spoke of a prosperous community. My sister-in-law's boarding house is on Maple Street, Vaughn said, guiding his horse down the main thoroughfare. She'll have dry clothes and hot food waiting. The boarding house proved to be a handsome two-story building with a wide porch and window boxes filled with bright flowers. A plump woman with Vaughn's same blue eyes hurried out to meet them as they dismounted. Vaughn Hayes. 3 weeks without a word and you show up looking like a drowned rat. Despite the scolding, her face was alight with pleasure. She turned curious eyes to Grace. And who might this be? Margaret, this is Grace Lowell, Vaughn said. Grace, my sister-in-law, Margaret Hayes. Pleased to meet you, madam, Grace said, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. Margaret's shrewd gaze took in Grace's soaked dress, the scratches on her hands, and the exhaustion evident in her posture. Without further questions, she ushered them both inside. Baths first, then food, then explanations, she declared, brooking no argument. An hour later, cleaned and dressed in borrowed clothing, Grace sat at Margaret's kitchen table, savoring a bowl of hearty stew while Vaughn explained the circumstances of their meeting and journey. Margaret listened without interruption, though her expressions shifted from shock to outrage to sympathy. When Vaughn described the ambush, her hand flew to her mouth in alarm. Emerson's men this close to town, she exclaimed. Sheriff Wilson needs to be informed immediately. I'll speak with him, Vaughn assured her. But first I wanted to make sure Grace was safely settled. Margaret patted Grace's hand. You'll stay here as long as you need, dear. And if you're willing to help with the cooking and cleaning, I'd be grateful for the assistance. My arthritis makes some tasks difficult these days. I'd be happy to help, Grace said sincerely. It's the least I can do after your brother-in-law's kindness. After the meal, Vaughn excused himself to visit the sheriff, promising to return later. Margaret showed Grace to a small but comfortable room on the second floor, providing her with additional clothing and basic necessities. Vaughn mentioned you lost your parents recently, Margaret said gently as she helped Grace make up the bed. I'm very sorry. Thank you, Grace replied. It's been difficult. Loss always is. Margaret smoothed the quilt with practiced hands. When my husband Vaughn's brother passed 6 years ago, I thought the pain would never ease, but time and good company help. Vaughn lost his wife and daughter, Grace said softly. Margaret nodded sadly. Yes, Caroline and little Emily were the light of his life. After they died, he threw himself into his work. This is the first time he's brought anyone to visit me in 4 years. Her shrewd eyes studied Grace. He must see something special in you. Grace felt her cheeks warm. He was simply being kind, doing his duty. My dear, Vaughn Hayes never does anything purely out of duty. He has the truest moral compass of any man I've known, but he also listens to his heart. She patted Grace's hand. Rest now. Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure out what comes next. Left alone, Grace sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the events of the past few days. From the horror of her uncle's attempt to sell her to the unexpected rescue by a man who asked nothing in return, her world had transformed completely. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to truly hope for a better future. She must have dozed off, because a soft knock at her door startled her awake. The light outside the window had dimmed to twilight. Come in, she called, sitting up and smoothing her borrowed dress. Vaughn entered, looking fresher in clean clothes, though she noticed he moved somewhat stiffly, likely from the bullet graze he'd mentioned. I wanted to check on you before turning in, he said, remaining by the door. The sheriff's organized patrols to search for Emerson's men. The town should be secure. Thank you. Grace hesitated, then asked, will you be staying in Willow Creek long? Something flickered across his face, regret perhaps. A few days at most. I need to report to the territorial office in Santa Fe, then continue tracking Emerson. I see. Grace tried to hide her disappointment. Well, I'm grateful for everything you've done. Your sister-in-law has offered me a position here, so I'll be well looked after. Vaughn nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. Margaret's a good woman, you'll be safe here. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Finally, Vaughn cleared his throat. I should let you rest. Good night, Miss Lowell. Good night, Marshal Hayes. After he closed the door, Grace moved to the window, watching as Vaughn crossed the yard below, heading toward the barn where Margaret had indicated he would stay. She pressed her hand against the glass, a strange ache in her chest at the thought of his imminent departure. The next few days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Grace helped Margaret with the boarding house duties, learning the routines and meeting the various lodgers, a schoolteacher, a young couple waiting for their homestead to be built, and an elderly gentleman who wrote articles for Eastern newspapers. Vaughn came and went, conferring with the sheriff and sending telegrams to his superiors. Each evening, he joined Grace and Margaret for dinner, the conversation flowing easily among them. Grace found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, memorizing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the sound of his rare but hearty laugh, the graceful strength in his hands as he passed dishes or poured coffee. On the third day, as Grace hung laundry in the back garden, Vaughn approached, his expression serious. I received a reply from Santa Fe, he said without preamble. I'm to continue tracking Emerson. There have been reports of him near the Colorado border. Grace nodded, focusing on pinning a sheet to the line so he wouldn't see her expression. When will you leave? Tomorrow at dawn. He paused, then added, I spoke with Sheriff Wilson. He's agreed to keep an eye on you while I'm gone. That's not necessary, Grace assured him, finally meeting his gaze. I can take care of myself. I know you can. His voice softened. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Grace Lowell, but humor me on this. Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. How long will you be gone? Difficult to say. Weeks, most likely, possibly months. The thought of not seeing him for so long created an unexpected hollow feeling in Grace's chest. Over just a few days, his presence had become something she relied upon, looked forward to. I'll write to Margaret regularly, he continued, to check on things here. That would be nice. Grace smoothed the sheet unnecessarily. We'd both like that. Vaughn took a step closer, close enough that she could see the different shades of blue in his eyes. Grace I. Vaughn. Margaret's voice called from the back door. Telegram from the sheriff's office, the moment shattered. Vaughn stepped back, his expression once again composed. Duty calls, he said with a small smile. We'll talk more at dinner, but that conversation never happened. By the time Grace finished the laundry and returned to the house, Vaughn had ridden out with the sheriff to investigate a reported sighting of one of the men who had ambushed them. He didn't return until late that night, long after Grace had retired to her room. The next morning, she rose before dawn, determined to see him before he left. She found him in the barn, saddling his horse, his saddlebags already packed and secured. I thought you might slip away without saying goodbye, she said softly from the doorway. Vaughn turned, surprise and something warmer lighting his face. I left a note with Margaret. I didn't want to wake you. Some things are worth waking up for. Grace stepped into the barn, her shawl wrapped tightly around her against the pre-dawn chill. I wanted to thank you properly. For everything. There's no need, there is. She moved closer, gathering her courage. 3 days ago, I had nothing. No family, no future, no hope. Now I have all three because of you. Vaughn's expression softened. You've always had a future, Grace. You just needed the freedom to find it. And you gave me that freedom. She reached out impulsively, touching his arm. Be careful out there. Emerson sounds dangerous. I've faced worse. His hand covered hers briefly. Take care of Margaret. She needs the company more than she'll admit. Grace nodded, fighting unexpected tears. This wasn't the goodbye she had imagined, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. Vaughn led his horse from the barn, checking the cinch one final time before mounting. From the saddle, he looked down at Grace, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I'll come back, he said quietly. When this is finished. It wasn't quite a promise, but Grace held onto the words as she watched him ride away, his figure gradually disappearing into the lightening sky. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable pattern. Grace threw herself into her work at the boarding house, learning to bake Margaret's famous apple pies, managing the accounts, and eventually taking over most of the daily operations as Margaret's arthritis worsened. The older woman became a mentor and friend, sharing stories of her life and subtly teaching Grace the skills she would need to be independent. True to his word, Vaughn wrote regularly brief, practical letters that reported his movements and inquired after their welfare. Grace treasured each one, reading between the sparse lines for hints of the man she had come to admire so deeply. Summer faded into autumn, and autumn chilled into winter. Christmas approached, bringing festive preparations to Willow Creek. Grace helped decorate the boarding house with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and assisted Margaret in baking dozens of cookies for the town's celebration. "Any word from Vaughn?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat by the fire, mending linens. "Not since his letter 3 weeks ago," Grace replied, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "He was in Denver then, following a new lead." Margaret studied her thoughtfully. "You care for him, don't you?" Grace's hands stilled on her sewing. There seemed little point in denying what had become increasingly clear to her over the months. "Yes, though I don't expect anything to come of it." "Why not? He still loves his wife," Grace said simply. "I can see it in every letter, hear it in every story about her. And I would never want to replace her memory." "Loving someone who's gone doesn't prevent loving someone who's here," Margaret said gently. "The heart has remarkable capacity." Before Grace could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Voices called excitedly and boots thumped on the porch. Margaret rose to answer the door, returning moments later with Sheriff Wilson, his expression grave. "Evening, ladies," he said, removing his hat. "Sorry to disturb you, but I've received news about Marshal Hayes." Grace's heart seemed to stop. He's alive," the sheriff assured her quickly. "But he's been injured. There was a confrontation with Emerson near Pikes Peak. The telegram says he's being treated in Colorado Springs and should recover fully." Relief flooded through Grace, followed immediately by concern. "How badly is he hurt?" Gunshot wound to the shoulder, and some exposure from being out in the cold too long before help arrived. But the doctor expects him to make a full recovery. The sheriff hesitated, then added, "The telegram also says he captured Emerson. The man's in custody and awaiting trial." "That's wonderful news," Margaret exclaimed. "When will Vaughn return to Willow Creek?" "That's just it," the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable. "The telegram mentioned he might be reassigned after he recovers. Something about a position in Wyoming Territory." Grace felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. Wyoming Territory. That was hundreds of miles away. If Vaughn took such an assignment, he might never return to Willow Creek. "I see," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Thank you for bringing us the news, Sheriff." After he left, Margaret reached out to squeeze Grace's hand. "Don't lose hope yet. Vaughn makes his own decisions, regardless of what the marshal's office suggests." Grace nodded, but in her heart, doubt bloomed. Vaughn had never made any promises beyond friendship. His duty had always come first. Why would that change now? 2 days before Christmas, a heavy snow blanketed Willow Creek, transforming the town into a picturesque winter scene. Grace spent the morning helping Margaret prepare for the boarding house's Christmas Eve dinner, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary as she tried to work through her tangled emotions. Margaret watched her with knowing eyes but said nothing, allowing Grace the space to process her feelings in her own way. Around midday, the jingling of sleigh bells announced visitors. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front window, expecting to see the merchant's delivery sled with their grocery order. Instead, a single horse-drawn sleigh was pulling up before the house, its lone occupant wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf. As the driver dismounted stiffly, Grace's heart leaped into her throat. Even bundled against the cold, there was no mistaking Vaughn Hayes' tall figure. Before Margaret could react, Grace had flung open the front door and was hurrying down the steps, heedless of the snow soaking her shoes and the hem of her dress. Vaughn turned at the sound of the door, his face lighting up at the sight of her. His left arm was secured in a sling beneath his coat, and his face looked thinner than she remembered, but his eyes, those remarkable blue eyes, were as warm and alive as ever. "Grace," he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. She stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. "The sheriff said you were in Colorado Springs. We didn't expect. I left as soon as the doctor cleared me for travel," he explained. "Couldn't miss Christmas." Margaret appeared in the doorway behind Grace. "Vaughn Hayes, you foolish man, traveling in your condition in this weather. Come inside before you catch your death," Vaughn smiled at his sister-in-law's scolding. "In a moment, Margaret." His gaze returned to Grace. "I need to speak with Grace first." Margaret made a sound that might have been exasperation or approval, then disappeared back into the house, closing the door firmly behind her. Snowflakes drifted down around them, catching in Grace's dark hair and on the shoulders of Vaughn's coat. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, rediscovering familiar features, noting the changes that months apart had wrought. "You captured Emerson," Grace finally said, breaking the silence. Vaughn nodded. "He'll face justice for his crimes." "And Wyoming territory. Sheriff Wilson mentioned you might be reassigned there." Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or dismay that she had heard this news. "That offer was made," he acknowledged. "A promotion. Chief Marshal for the Northern District." Grace's heart sank, though she forced a smile. "Congratulations, that's quite an honor." "I declined it." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Grace stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she'd heard. "You declined a promotion. Why?" Vaughn took a step closer, close enough that she could see the snowflakes melting on his eyelashes. "Because my future isn't in Wyoming territory. It's here, if you'll have me." Grace felt dizzy with hope and disbelief. "What are you saying, Vaughn?" He reached out with his good hand, gently touching her cheek. "I'm saying that I've spent the last 6 months thinking about you every day, about your courage, your kindness, your strength. About how, for the first time since I lost Caroline and Emily, I found myself looking forward instead of back." His voice grew softer. "I'm saying that I love you, Grace Lowell, and if you'll give me the chance, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving it." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, instantly freezing on her lashes in the cold air. "But your badge, your duty, will always be part of who I am," he acknowledged. "But I've requested a transfer to the local office. Sheriff Wilson is retiring next spring, and they've offered me his position." A small smile curved his lips. "I'd like to put down roots, Grace. With you, if that's what you want." "It is," she whispered, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It's all I've wanted since the day you walked into that saloon and said I was worth more than your life." "You are," he said simply, "worth everything." He bent down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that melted the winter chill, and sealed a promise that had begun the moment he'd saved her from her uncle's cruelty. Grace's arms slipped around his waist, careful of his injured shoulder, as she returned the kiss with all the love that had grown in her heart over the months of knowing him. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Margaret's voice called from the doorway. "For heaven's sake, you two. Come inside before I have to nurse you both through pneumonia." Hand in hand, they climbed the steps to the porch, where Margaret waited with tears in her eyes and a wide smile on her face. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," Vaughn said, placing a kiss on his sister-in-law's cheek. "I hope you don't mind if I stay." "Mind," she scoffed, ushering them inside. "I've been saving your room in the barn since the day you left, though I suspect you won't be sleeping there for long." She gave Grace a knowing look that brought color to her cheeks. Later that evening, as they sat before the fire in the parlor, Vaughn presented Grace with a small, wrapped package. "An early Christmas gift," he explained. Inside, she found a delicate gold locket. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny photograph of her parents on one side, a duplicate of the one she kept in her satchel. "How did you?" "I had a photographer in Denver copy it when I visited last month," Vaughn explained. "The other side is empty for now, for our future memories." Grace closed her hand around the precious gift, too moved for words. Vaughn seemed to understand, drawing her close against his side. "6 months ago, I paid $20 in gold for your freedom," he murmured against her hair. "Best investment I ever made," Grace smiled through happy tears. And I gained something beyond price a future filled with love. Outside, snow continued to fall on Willow Creek, blanketing the town in peaceful white. But inside the boarding house on Maple Street, warmth and love created a sanctuary that would endure through all the seasons to come.